This happened in 2001 when I was 15. It was during the summer holiday, and me, my best friend and one of my cousins were in a state of permanent boredom. Not much to do in our small town. One weekend, we had managed to convince our parents to let us go on a camping trip on our own, just for 2 nights. We were planning to take the kayaks and make our way to a small island in the archipelago and spend the day fishing and swimming. We were all pretty outdoorsy people and it shouldn't be a problem. We had a great day, and as night approached, we decided to set up our tent and go to sleep. During the process of setting up the tent, my cousin Sophie told us about her last camping trip, where she had been awoken by a curious moose outside of the tent, and we all thought it was hilarious to be scared of a moose. We grilled some fish over the fire before we went to bed, and as we were all pretty tired, we fell asleep instantly. I woke up a few hours later when Bella, my best friend, sat up straight and pointed towards the entry of the tent. "I heard something," she whispered. We sat there listening, but the sound was gone, and after a while, we fell asleep again. Soon, I was woken up again, by Sophie this time. "There's someone outside," she stated, her voice laced with a cold kind of fear that made me instantly wide awake. I tried to see or hear any sign of anybody being outside of our tent, but it took several minutes of staring into nothingness before I saw it. A very slow movement, the light summer night allowing a shadow play on the thin canvas of our tent. It wasn't the shadow of a tree or an animal. Or was it? It moved so slow that it was hard to know if you imagined it or if it was actually real. We could hear the opening and closing of our cool box, and someone stepping on the coal around the fire pit. Bella gripped my forearm tight as she mimed, "The knife." Sure enough, we had left our knife outside, the one we had used for the fish hours earlier. We sat there in silence. Some unknown person with unknown intent was going through our things, and it was only a matter of time before that someone found our knife. And then what? Would he start stabbing at the tent? We couldn't get up and run. We would be spotted immediately. And anyway, it was a small island. Who would go there in the middle of the night? Or had that person already been there when we arrived and seen us approach? We barely dared to breathe as we waited for something to happen, until the tension was too much for Bella, always the impulsive one, who reached for her flashlight and was making a move to go outside, when we grabbed hold of her and the shadow stopped in its tracks outside. We could hear something being dropped and hitting a rock. Then, slow steps moving in a half circle around the tent, ending up directly behind us, where we couldn't see it anymore. I've never been so frightened in my life. Suddenly, Bella shouted, "We have a gun, and we phoned the police," with the voice of someone who meant every word she said. There was a soft sound of someone walking on moss, and soon there was nothing but silence. We waited for a while until we worked up the courage to run out of our tent, to the kayaks, and left. We didn't take anything with us, we just left. We were back home at dawn and told my parents what had happened. First they thought we were joking, but when they realized we had actually left all of our stuff, they realized it was real and phoned the police. The police took it more seriously than we had ever thought they would, and there was a reason for that. A few days earlier, a man, an ex-gym teacher, had assaulted his wife very badly and fled the scene before police arrived. They thought he was coming out to avoid being found and was thought to be dangerous and desperate. We made many more camping trips after this, but we took our dogs with us. So, when my dad was roughly 9 or so years old, him and a couple of his cousins, the oldest 13, were hanging out at a park in Massachusetts. It was summer and a hot day, and the year was 1968, I believe. As he and his cousins were trying to avoid the heat, a man meets them and introduces himself as Stanley Rice, a nice enough looking guy with a camera bag. They strike up conversation and the heat comes up. Stanley mentions an old swimming hole that he knows about in a creek little ways out of town and offers to show them the way. Being naive children in the less suspicious 60s, They agree and set out for the creek. They walk and walk and walk, cross the train tracks a mile out of town, and walk another 20 minutes until the oldest cousin rejoins the group of kids. For the majority of the trip, the oldest had been walking with Stanley and talking to him. As he saunters back to the group, still lazily following Stanley, he whispers to my dad, "That bag has a totally different name on it, and he's got a pistol." As this happens, they reach the swimming hole. They plan to break for it when Stanley gets in the water. Strangely enough, Stanley is already wearing swimming trunks as he strips his pants. He tells the boys to come on in and join him as he dives in the water. They scatter and began running as fast as they can back home. Having watched too many army shows, they start zigzagging back and forth as they hear Stanley cling out and grab the pistol. My dad looked back, and the last thing he saw was Stanley Rice on one knee with a Luger pistol pointed at him, yelling his head off. So they all escaped, and none of them told their parents. 6 months later, Stanley Rice was arrested. Turns out he was an escaped mental patient whose MO was raping little boys and burying them in the sand of creek beds. Apparently when they caught him, he'd already killed more than 10, I believe, and had 2 kids captive, bound in a van. So that's one of the near-death stories my dad has, in which I almost wasn't born. At the end of May 1999, I was headed into my freshman year of high school. That summer, me and a group of 6 girls from my church went on a mission trip up the coast from Riverside, California to Mount St. Helens, Washington. 3 of the girls' mother acted as our driver and chaperone. We basically all piled into an old Chevy van and a station wagon and headed up PCH and had the trip of a lifetime. I got baptized at a historic mission in San Luis Obispo. We spent 3 days in San Francisco, saw the Capitol, Portland, Oregon, Yosemite, and basically we got to see every worthy landmark and stay in every noteworthy town from SoCal to the Canadian border. When we stayed in Yosemite National Park, we spent 3 nights at the Cedar Lodge. While in Yosemite and sightseeing, the old Chevy van died in the middle of nowhere. Luckily, even though we were unable to get a phone signal, within an hour somebody stopped and helped us. This was so long ago that I don't remember all the details, but basically the owner of the van told us later that the mechanic told her that somebody tampered with the engine. She was very upset by this and said that it was something that was done intentionally. The van had to be abandoned and we had to use a rental the rest of the way. I don't know if it's a coincidence, but turns out that Carrie Anthony Stainer, aka the Yosemite Killer, was the maintenance man for the Cedar Lodge during this time. He had murdered and decapitated a park ranger by the time we were guests at the lodge. The very next month, he gained access to a room where a woman and her young daughter and her daughter's young friend were staying under the guise of checking their room for something. And basically he knocked on the door in the middle of the night, and because he worked for the lodge, they opened the door. He abducted them, then raped, murdered and decapitated them. I can't say that I remember seeing him, but we probably did, as we were there for 3 full nights. It's just one of those things that I look back on and think that he could have easily knocked on our door, as it was just a few weeks prior that this happened, and decided that he wanted to abduct and kill us. I feel incredibly lucky, as if we dodged a bullet. If the time frame wasn't so close, it wouldn't creep me out as much, but it continues to haunt me 16 years later.